She had one night to make the most important decision of her life. Behind her was a hotel room with a ring on the dressing table, an engagement she never agreed to, and a man who wanted to marry her, not because he loved her, but because she knew something he needed. Ahead of her was a parking garage, a dark SUV with an unlocked door, and a stranger sitting in the driver's seat who already knew her name before she said a word. One envelope. 5 lines in her father's handwriting, and a single instruction that changed everything. Do not marry him. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you know. Most people in that moment would have panicked. Nora did not panic. She made a calculation, and that calculation led her straight into the car of the most dangerous man in Chicago. Not dangerous because of what he carried, dangerous because of what he knew about everyone, about everything, about her father's 20 years of silence, about the truth that was about to cost both of them more than they were ready to pay. This channel is built for people who understand that some individuals are simply born to operate at a different level. There are lessons about power, about loyalty, about how the world actually works, that no classroom will ever teach you. Only the ones who have lived inside real power know them. We do not tell stories about crime here. We tell stories about mindset, about backbone, and about the hidden architecture of genuine authority. This story is about what happens when a woman who has been invisible her entire life finally decides she is worth being seen, and what happens to the man who spent 11 years knowing everything about everyone, the moment he meets the one person he has no file on. The lesson here is not about romance. It is about what it truly means to protect someone, what it means to carry a secret too long, what it means to finally trust another person with the weight you have been holding alone, and what it costs when you do not. If this story made you feel something real, the most powerful thing you can do right now takes less than 3 seconds. Hit the like button, drop a comment telling me which moment hit you hardest, and share this with the one person in your life who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, the kind that stay with you long after the audio ends.
Nora Voss had memorized the location of 34,000 documents, and not one of them told her why her father had to die. She sat on the edge of a hotel bed in a dress she never intended to wear past tonight. Deep plum, silk. The kind of dress someone picks for you when they've already decided who you're supposed to be. The Peninsula Hotel, room 1412, Chicago, November. Outside the window, Lake Michigan looked like a sheet of dark glass, and the city lights stretched along its edge like something that had always been burning and would never stop. She wasn't supposed to be thinking. She was supposed to be resting before her wedding day. Instead, she was holding a white envelope that had been sitting in the bottom of her work bag for 8 months, unopened, because Bernard told her it was financial paperwork, because she had been grieving, because she believed him. 8 months of believing him. She opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, her father's handwriting, neat, slanted, the kind of cursive she learned to read before she learned to print. It said this: Nora, if you are reading this, I ran out of time to say it out loud. Do not marry Webb. Not because I am telling you not to, because I know exactly why he wants you, and you deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you know. Below that, an address in the West Loop, and one final line: Callum Reyes will understand. She read it twice, then a third time. Then she folded it exactly along the original crease, the way her father had taught her to fold maps, and she put it in the small inside pocket of her coat. She stood up. She took off the engagement ring Marcus Webb had placed on her finger 3 hours earlier at the engagement dinner. The ring was enormous and cold and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are meant to impress strangers, rather than the person wearing them. She set it on the dressing table. looked at it for exactly 1 second. Then she picked up her coat, her small bag, and she walked out of the room. The service stairwell was at the end of the hall. She knew because her father had shown her. They had stayed at this hotel once when she was 16, when he came to a cartography conference. He always showed her the emergency exits before he showed her anything else. You never know when you need to know the way out, Nora. Everyone shows you the entrance. You have to find the exit yourself. The parking garage was on level B2, fluorescent lights, the smell of concrete and motor oil and cold air. She moved at a pace that looked intentional without looking urgent. That was the balance. Her father had taught her that too. Move like you know where you are going, even when you don't. She needed to get out of the building. She needed a car or a cab to the West Loop address. She needed to do both before Bernard Voss realized she was gone. Then she heard footsteps. 2 sets. Coming fast from the direction of the main elevator. She recognized the shoes before she saw the faces. Black dress shoes, polished to an almost aggressive shine. Marcus Webb required that of all his staff. She had noticed it at the engagement dinner and filed it away the way she filed everything. Automatically, without deciding to. She had maybe 10 seconds. She looked down the row of parked SUVs. Black cars, silver cars, a dark green one at the end. The nearest black SUV had its back door not fully closed, not locked. In the parking garage of a luxury hotel on a Friday night. That was unusual enough to notice. She didn't think about it further. She pulled the door open, slid inside, and pulled it shut behind her, as quietly as she could manage. She dropped to the floor behind the front seats. The footsteps moved through the garage, paused somewhere to her left, then faded. She exhaled, closed her eyes for 1 second, opened them, and realized the engine was running. There was a man in the driver's seat. He had been there the entire time. He said without turning around, in a voice that was completely, almost offensively calm, "It's a cold night to be sitting on a floor." She was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she said, "I am not here to hurt anyone, in case that is what you are thinking." He said, "I know." She said, "Then why are you just sitting there?" He said, "I also know that your brother is in Boston, that you have been paying his tuition for the past 2 years, that you have worked at the Hargrove Institute for 4 years, and that 8 months ago you lost your father." Complete silence from the back seat. He said, "Nora Voss." Not a question. She pulled herself up off the floor and sat properly in the back seat. She looked at him in the rear-view mirror. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe early 40s. A face that wasn't remarkable in any specific way. Not handsome in the obvious sense. Not intimidating in the obvious sense either. But there was something about how still he was. Like someone who had learned, a long time ago, that stillness communicates more than movement. She said, "You are Callum Reyes." He said, "I am." She said, "My father left your name." A small pause. Not long, but she caught it. "When?" She said, "In a note. I opened it tonight." She held it in her hand but did not offer it. "He said you would understand. I do not know what that means yet." The car began to move. Slow, steady, a completely ordinary pace. Two of Webb's security people watched it pass the garage exit. Neither one flagged it down. When they reached the street, Callum said, "There is a place I need to take you. Safe. You can come inside or you do not have to. That is your choice." She said, "How long did my father work with you?" He said, 15 years. She said, "Did he trust you?" Callum thought about that for a moment. Then he said, "Not in those words. But he left your name in my care in the worst possible situation." I think that was how he said it. She looked out the window at the city moving past. Chicago in November. All dark glass and cold light and the kind of wind that finds every gap in your coat. Her father had written one name. In his final note. The last thing he chose to leave her. She said, "All right." And that was how it started. Not with a plan, Not with safety, just with a note and a name, and a woman who trusted that her father never wasted words. The building in the West Loop had no name on the door. That was the first thing Nora noticed. No logo, no company listing. Just a plain door on the ground floor of an office building that looked like every other office building on that block. The kind of unremarkable that takes effort to achieve. The second thing she noticed, when they stepped into the elevator and rode to the 14th floor in silence, was that Callum had a keycard that did not require scanning. He just held it near the reader, and the elevator moved. No beep, no indicator light. Like the building already knew him. The office on the 14th floor was one large room. Maps covered the walls. Chicago across different eras, 1871, 1920, 1968, the present day, all of them framed and positioned at eye level. Two long filing cabinets along one wall, a wide work table in the center with a lamp positioned for reading, not for atmosphere, and a desk near the window with a simple chair and a glass of water already sitting on it. He had expected her. Nora walked in and did what she always did in a new space. She read it. This was not a room designed to impress. That alone told her something. People who want to impress you put things in rooms to tell you how important they are. This room said nothing except that the person who worked here actually worked. Then she saw the maps on the far wall. Not the printed Chicago maps, the others. Smaller, handmade, the paper slightly yellowed at the edges. She moved toward them before she realized she was moving. She said quietly, "That is my father's work." Callum said from behind her, 12 years of it. He updated them every quarter. She reached out and touched the edge of one map. Just the paper. The way you touch something to check if it is real. She could see her father's hand in every line. The way he placed the notation marks. The specific shorthand for dates that he had built when she was a child and taught only to her. She said, "He never showed me these." Callum said, "He was protecting you." She said, "From what?" He said, "From knowing what he knew." He believed that the kind of knowledge he was building could not exist safely alongside a normal life. So he chose to give you the normal life. She said, "He chose not to tell me." Callum said, "He chose you over the work, until he could not make that choice anymore." She stood in front of her father's maps for a long moment. His hands had drawn these lines. In this room. For this man. While she was going to work and calling Jake on Sunday evenings and paying bills and living what she had thought was just her life. She said, "He knew someone was going to kill him." Callum said, "He knew someone was coming. He did not know when." She turned around. "Then explain the rest." They sat down across the work table from each other, and Callum explained. Edmund Voss had worked for him for 15 years. Not officially, not on paper. Edmund was a cartographer in every sense of the word. He did not just map geography. He mapped relationships, transactions, money flows, the invisible architecture of who owed what to whom. 2 decades of documentation encoded in the system he had built with his daughter when she was 7 years old, using bedtime stories and what he called fun math. Callum said, "He mapped evidence, not just relationships. Every transaction, every meeting, every payment. 20 years of it. Enough to bring down not one or two people, but an entire structure of power in this state that has been running quietly for a generation." Nora said, "And someone found out." He said, "Someone found out. I do not know who. What I know is that the map I recovered through an anonymous archive donation this year is either bait or it is a message your father intended to be found. I need someone who can read it to tell me which." She said, "And I am the only one who can read it." He said, "You are the only person alive who knows the full encoding system. He built it specifically for you." She looked at her hands on the table, then she looked up. She said, "That means you need me more than I need you." He said, "Yes." She said, "Then the terms are mine." He held her gaze. "Tell me what you want." She did not hesitate. 1. I want to know who killed my father. 2. Jake stays out of this completely unless I decide otherwise. 3. When this is done, I am free. No debt, no surveillance, no contact I did not choose. A pause. He was not deciding whether to agree. He was deciding whether he could keep the commitment. She could see the difference in his face. He said, "Agreed." She nodded once. "Then show me the map." He took it from a flat file drawer under the work table, spread it carefully across the surface between them, and she began to read it. It took her 90 minutes to decode the first layer, the outer structure, the broad relationships. Callum sat across from her and said nothing unless she asked him something. When she needed context for a name, a location, a date, he provided it without commentary. Two people working, clean, efficient, no wasted time. At the end of that first session, she sat back and said, "He built a library." Callum said quietly, "He built a bomb." She looked at him, "And he left the trigger to me." He did not look away. "Yes." She gathered her coat, stood. "I will need 2 days to decode the full structure. After that, we will know what we are working with." He said, "Take the time you need." She said, "I am not doing this for you." He said, "I know." At the door she paused, did not turn around. "There is a small apartment 2 blocks from here. Clean, private, safe. Bernard will check the hotels. He will not check a building with no public listing." She said, "How do you know about the hotels?" He said, "The same way I know most things. Your guardian made 4 calls in the last 3 hours, 2 of them to hotel security desks. By now he has checked the Peninsula and the Waldorf." She thought about that. Then she said, "I will take the apartment." She walked out, and in the elevator down, she held her father's note one more time. 5 lines, one name. He had written it knowing she might need it, knowing exactly the kind of night it would take for her to finally open the envelope. He had known her that well. He had trusted her that much. She folded the note back along its crease and put it in her pocket. The elevator reached the ground floor. She walked out into the Chicago night, still in her engagement party dress, and she did not look back. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock. Nora arrived at the 14th floor office carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag from the bakery on the corner. She had been awake since 6. There was nothing else to do with that time except think about the map, and thinking about the map at 6 a.m. in a bare apartment with no notebooks led nowhere useful. Callum was already there. He had been there since before she arrived. She could tell by the way the lamp had already been adjusted and the map was already spread flat on the work table with small weights at each corner. She set 1 coffee in front of him without asking. He looked at it, looked at her, looked back at the map. She sat down and opened her notebook. He said, "You didn't have to." She said, "I know." He picked up the coffee. No further comment. She noticed how he drank it. Slowly, deliberately, the way people drink when they have been eating and drinking alone long enough that it stopped feeling like a social activity, like fuel rather than comfort. She recognized it because her father had been the same way after her mother died. They worked. She decoded the first cluster, then the second. Callum provided context for each one. A name she uncovered connected to a political fundraiser, a date that matched a zoning approval, a set of transactions running through 3 shell companies, mapped in her father's geographic notation as if they were tributaries feeding a river. They did not need to explain much to each other. She placed a piece. He placed the next one. There was a rhythm to it. The kind of rhythm that usually takes months to build and was already here on the second day. Then she said, "This symbol cluster here. I can read the outer 2 layers. The inner layer needs real-world context I don't have. It's a building, possibly a meeting location. Do you know this address?" She described the notation. Callum stood up, walked to the far filing cabinet, opened the 3rd drawer from the left, counted in exactly 6 folders, pulled one out, brought it back and set it open between them. She looked at him. She said, "You use the same organizational system my father used." He said, "He taught me, 15 years ago. He said that if you cannot find something in 10 seconds, You do not actually own it. She looked back at the map. This man had not just known her father. Her father had taught him how to hold information. That kind of teaching, that kind of trust between two people, was not something you built quickly or gave away casually. She said, "What was he like when you first met him?" Callum thought about it. Careful, more careful than anyone I had ever worked with. He did not say anything he had not already considered. He did not commit to anything he did not intend to keep. A pause. The first meeting, he brought a map he had made of the building we were meeting in, not to show me he had done his research, just because that was how he thought. He wanted to understand the physical space before he understood anything else. She said, "He did that everywhere. My whole childhood. We would arrive somewhere new, and he would spend 10 minutes just walking the perimeter. I thought it was anxiety. It wasn't." "No," Callum said. "It was precision." She decoded another cluster. A name came up she did not recognize. She read the surrounding notation: mail, financial sector, internal connection, secondary ring, year unknown. She said, "This person. Do you know the connection?" Callum went still. She looked up. He said very quietly, "That is my brother." She stopped moving. He said, "Daniel. He worked in finance. He was building a case against some of the same people I had been watching for years. He did it alone. He didn't tell me because he was afraid I would stop him." A pause so small she almost missed it. "He disappeared on a Thursday afternoon. They found his car near the river. There was no body." He said it in the voice of someone who has said the same thing many times in private. Flat. Exact. Each word placed carefully, the way you carry something fragile over a long distance. She looked at the notation surrounding Daniel's marker. Her father had placed him in the center ring. Not the outer ring where he placed people he tracked for risk. The center ring. Where he placed the people he was trying to protect. She said, "My father mapped what happened to your brother. It is here." He did not move. She did not point at the map from across the table and explain it. She stood up, walked around to his side, placed the map between them, and read it to him. Entry by entry. Everything her father had documented. The last 6 months of Daniel's work. The people he had been investigating. The moment the trail went cold. She read it because this was news about his brother. And no one should have to hear that kind of thing while sitting alone. When she finished, neither of them spoke. They stood side by side, looking at the map. The lamp cast a circle of warm light across her father's notation. 30 seconds. The heating system clicked on somewhere in the building. A car horn on the street below. Callum said very quietly, "He left a map for everyone he lost. Your father was very thorough." She said, "He loved people by documenting them. It was the only language he had." A moment between them. Both of them understanding that what she had just said about her father was also true of the man standing beside her. Then Callum said, "There is one more thing the map is saying. Your father did not put the evidence in one location." "No," she said. "He split it. 7 pieces, 7 separate locations." She pointed to the 7 outer markers. "This map is not the evidence. It is the directions to the evidence." Callum studied the markers. She said, "One of the locations is in Boston." He said nothing. She said it again, more quietly. "One of the 7 locations is in the same city where Jake goes to school." He looked at her. "Your brother does not know." "No," she said, "and I need to keep it that way for as long as possible." He nodded once. She put on her coat. He walked her to the door without being asked. At the threshold she turned, and before she could stop herself, she said, "Your system is better than mine at the archive. Whatever he taught you about organization, he taught you that part better than he taught me." She left before he could answer. In the elevator down, she thought about the way Daniel's name had sounded when Callum said it. Present tense. Not someone who was gone. Someone who was still, in some unresolved and quiet way, here. She understood that particular grammar. She had been speaking it herself for 8 months. The elevator opened. Chicago morning. Cold and bright. She walked toward the main street with her notebook under her arm, and she did not feel less afraid than she had yesterday, but she felt less alone. Day 3. Nora brought sandwiches. She did not announce this. She did not explain it. She set one in front of Callum when she arrived and sat down and opened her notebook. He looked at the sandwich, looked at her, said nothing, then ate. The way he ate told her what she already suspected. Slowly, without distraction. He was not scrolling a phone or reading documents while he chewed. He was just eating. The way people eat when they have been alone long enough that meals stopped feeling like they were worth performing for anyone. She recognized it. Her father had eaten the same way in the last years of his life, after her mother died, after whatever he had gotten himself into with his maps had started to become real and heavy and impossible to put down. They worked through the morning in almost complete silence, not the silence of people who have nothing to say, the silence of people who do not need to fill air with sound to feel comfortable. She decoded. He cross-referenced. She would name a symbol cluster, and he would have the relevant folder on the table before she finished describing it. He would name a date, and she would find the corresponding notation in the map before he said what he was looking for. On the second day, they had needed to explain everything in full sentences. By the third day, they had already built a shorthand. That kind of shorthand usually takes months. She looked at his notebook at one point while she was reaching for her pencil. He wrote questions, not answers, long columns of questions, each one numbered. Most of them had no line through them. This was someone who lived with more unanswered questions than answered ones. She filed that away. Around noon, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Jake. She looked at it for exactly 1 second, deciding which version of herself was going to answer. She picked up. Jake said, "Hey, Bernard's people called me this morning. Said something was going on with you. Said you were having a crisis or something and they needed to reach you. What is happening?" She said, "Nothing serious. Plans changed last minute. I am fine." Jake said, "You don't sound fine." She said, "I am staying with a colleague for a few days. Everything is okay." Jake said, "Nora." She said, "Jake." A silence between them. He was 22 and brilliant, and she had been managing what he knew and what he did not know for 8 months, and he was smart enough to feel the weight of that without being able to name it. He said, "Okay, call me this weekend?" She said, "This weekend, I promise." She hung up. Callum said, without looking up from the folder he was reading, "He doesn't know." Not a question. She said, "He is finishing his thesis. He has a girlfriend. He has a life that is not connected to any of this." Callum said, "He is going to find out eventually." She said, "Eventually is not today." He looked up then, studied her in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand, not just observe. He said, "Your father did the same thing, protected everyone by keeping them in the dark, carried it all himself." She said, "Is that a warning?" He said, "It is an observation. The Voss family has a pattern." She looked at the map between them. She knew he was right. Knowing he was right did not change anything about the decision she had already made. She said, "That pattern kept Jake in school and kept me out of trouble for 8 months." He said, "That pattern also meant Edmund never told anyone when he needed to." A long silence. Then she said, "Show me the next cluster." They worked through the afternoon. At some point in the late afternoon, a name came up that she decoded carefully and set aside, not sure what to do with it. It was placed differently than the others, not in any of the relationship rings, in a category her father used only for the people he considered the center of gravity of a network. The load-bearing point. Remove this, and everything else becomes unstable. She said, "This marker here. This is different from the rest. He only used this notation for one kind of node." Callum leaned in and looked. He said, "Senator Harlan Mast." She said, "He is running for governor." Callum said, "He has been running something much larger than a political campaign for 20 years. Your father knew. He documented all of it." She sat with that. A politician. Not just criminal enterprise, Political infrastructure. The kind of power that does not get taken down by a single piece of evidence or a single news story. The kind of power that has lawyers and press teams and systems designed specifically to survive exposure. She said, "How do you stop something like that?" He said, "Carefully, and with the right kind of archive." That word sat between them. Archive. She looked at him. He was looking at the map, and she thought she understood something about what her father had been building. Not a bomb, not in the way Callum had said earlier. Something more patient than that. A record, a library. The kind of thing that does not destroy power in a single day, but outlasts it across time. Toward evening, Callum stood and stretched and said, "I am ordering food. There is a Polish place nearby that is good." She looked up. "You don't have to." He said, "You brought sandwiches this morning." She said, "That was different." He said, "Was it?" She did not answer. He ordered. They ate at the work table. The maps were folded and set aside for the first time in 3 days. The table was just a table for 20 minutes, and the food was warm, and the city outside the window did its usual November thing of looking cold and beautiful and indifferent. He told her about the library in Pilsen where he had learned to read maps. An old man named Andrew, Polish-born, who had believed that maps were the truest language human beings ever invented. Not because they were precise, because they showed what someone cared enough about to measure. He said, Andrew used to say, "Show me where a person lives, where they work, where they eat, where they go at night, and I will show you everything about them that their words will never say." She said, "My father used to say almost exactly that." He said, "I know." He quoted Andrew every time we disagreed about method. She said, "They knew each other?" He said, "No, they just thought the same way." She considered that. Two men who had never met, in different parts of the world, arriving at the same philosophy about maps and the people who make them. She said, "Is that why my father trusted you? Because you thought the same way?" Callum said, "He came to me after Daniel disappeared. He was the only person outside my network who knew to come to me. He said he had been watching me work for years, and he said I was the only person in this city who mapped people to protect them rather than to use them." She said, "Is that still true?" He was quiet for a moment. "It used to be cleaner. I started because I wanted to protect people. Then I became something people needed to be protected from as well. Your father kept working with me even after that changed." A pause. "I never fully understood why." She said, "Because he thought you could come back to it." He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. She said, "The fifth location on the map. I want to decode that section tomorrow morning. I think it contains the key to understanding how the 7 pieces fit together." He said, "I will have coffee here." She put on her coat. He did not follow her to the door. She did not ask him to, but at the threshold she stopped. And without entirely deciding to, she said, "He was right about you, my father. He kept that notation in the center ring for a reason." She left. In the elevator going down, she pressed the lobby button and stood still while the floors counted backward and thought about the way Callum had gone quiet when she said that. Not defensive, not dismissive, just quiet. Like a person receiving something they were not sure they had the right to accept. She understood that too. Monday morning, Nora went to the Hargrove Institute. She needed reference materials, cross-documentation from the 1990s real estate records that would help her confirm the timeline on the map's 3rd layer, the kind of thing that lived in the physical archive and nowhere else. She walked in at 8:15, said good morning to Phil at the security desk. Phil was 60 years old and had worked at Hargrove for 19 years and had the manner of a man who had seen so many researchers come and go that he had essentially become part of the furniture in the best possible way. He said, "Morning, Miss Voss, early today." She said, "Reference pull, won't take long." She went down to the archive. It took her 4 minutes to know that something was wrong. Nothing was missing, nothing was visibly disturbed. But on shelf 12F, the third row from the top, the document box covering materials from 1967 through 1971 had been replaced at a slightly different angle than she had left it. The lid was not quite flush. Someone had opened it and closed it again without putting it back exactly right. No one else would have noticed. Nora noticed because she had memorized not just the location of 34,000 documents but their condition, the angle of every box lid, the wear patterns on every folder tab. She stood in the aisle for a moment, thought about it, thought about what a person would be looking for in that particular year range. Then she went back upstairs, nodded to Phil, walked out of the building, and called Callum. He was there in 19 minutes. She counted. He came through the front door in a gray coat, hands in his pockets, looking like someone with a meeting in the building, rather than someone who had just been called because a document box was 6 degrees out of alignment. Phil opened the door before Callum reached it, not because of the rules, because of something else entirely. She showed him the shelf. He looked without touching. He said, "3 people had after-hours access here last night. 2 of them are your colleagues with keys. The third came through the loading dock." She said, "How do you know that?" He said, "The loading dock camera has a 14-second blind spot that occurs every hour on the hour. Someone used it at 1:17 a.m. She looked at him. "You have mapped this building." He said without apology, "I map any building where people I am responsible for spend significant time." She said, "Am I someone you are responsible for?" He looked at her steadily. "You are helping me complete what Edmund left, so yes." A pause. "And not only because of that." She filed that away, did not comment on it. She said, "They were not looking for the map. I have the map. What were they looking for?" He said, "You." She looked at him. He said, "They were not here to steal documents. They were here to confirm you were still working here regularly, to establish your pattern." He moved toward the door. "We need to go see someone." Her name was Rita Donovan. She was 51 years old and owned a chain of dry cleaning businesses on the north side that were exactly as legitimate as they appeared to be, and also something else entirely. She had a table at the back of a River North restaurant where she met people she needed to meet, and when Callum called ahead, the table was already cleared by the time they arrived. Rita looked at Nora the moment they sat down. She said, "Edmund's daughter." Not a question. Nora said, "You knew my father." Rita said, "Everyone who mattered knew Edmund. He was precise about everything. The kind of man you remember because of how careful he was." She looked at her coffee. "I was sorry to hear about what happened to him." She said it like she knew more about what happened to him than the police report. Nora filed that away too. Then Rita looked at Callum. Her voice dropped. She said, "The person who was in her archive last night is not a freelancer. He works for someone who has been very quiet for a very long time, been sitting still, building something, not making noise." She paused. "And whoever that is, they are not interested in your maps. They are interested in her." She pointed at Nora. Nora said, "Why?" Rita said, "Because they know what you can read, and they have figured out that whatever Edmund built, it does not work without you." They drove back in silence. On the street outside Nora's Pilsen building, Callum stopped walking. She stopped a step past him and turned. He said, "There is something I need to tell you. About how the map came to you." She said, "Tell me." He said, "The donation box that contained your father's map did not end up at Hargrove by accident. He arranged it. He arranged for a specific box from a specific address in Lincoln Park to be donated to a specific archive after his death. To your archive. To arrive during your shift." He paused. "He planned it before he died. He knew someone was coming. He did not know when, so he built a fail-safe." She said, "Me." He said, "You." In every version of the future he could account for, you were the person who found the map. He spent 20 years keeping you clear of all of this. The last decision he made was that you were the only one who could finish it. The wind off Lake Michigan moved through the street between the buildings. November wind, the kind that finds every gap. She said, "He could have burned it, destroyed everything and just let it die." Callum said, "Yes." She said, "He didn't." He said, "He chose you." She stood with that, both things at once, the grief of knowing he had known and had not told her, and something else, something harder to name but heavier. He had seen her. He had known exactly who she was, what she was capable of, and he had trusted her with the most important work of his life. She said, "He trusted you too. I can see it in the maps. He placed you in the center ring, not the tracking ring." Callum looked at her. She said, "He had a reason. I am still figuring out what it is." She turned toward her building. From behind her, Callum said, "Nora?" First time he had used her name without it being a statement of identification. She turned. He said, "Be careful tomorrow. The person who was in your archive will be watching for your pattern. Change your arrival time. Use the east entrance." She nodded. "And you?" He said, "I am going to find out who sent him." She went inside. In the narrow stairwell going up to the third floor, she stopped on the landing and stood still for a moment. 3 floors of old building, radiator heat, someone's dinner cooking on another floor. Her father had seen all of this coming, had planned for it, had put 2 specific people in motion and trusted them to find their way to the same place. She climbed the rest of the stairs. 4 days later, they had settled into a working rhythm. She arrived at 9. He was always already there. She decoded, he cross-referenced. Sometimes they ate lunch at the work table, sometimes they did not eat at all, and only realized it when it was nearly dark outside. On this particular evening, they were working through the last section of the map. The outer layers were fully decoded. The center layer, the one containing the actual locations of the 7 evidence pieces, was nearly complete. She noted that Callum had a new book on his desk, a thick academic volume, History of Chicago Cartography, 1890 to 1960. The spine was already cracked. He had been reading it heavily. She did not comment on it, but she understood what it meant. He was learning her father's field, not to impress her, not to manipulate her, to understand the man he had worked alongside for 15 years and had not, perhaps, fully understood. That mattered to her more than she expected it to. She decoded the 6th location, a storage facility in a suburb south of the city. Her father had marked it with a specific notation that indicated physical materials, not digital. Boxes, paper records. Then she reached the 7th. Boston. She had known it was there. She had seen the outer marker 3 days ago, but seeing the full notation now, seeing the exact building, the exact floor, the specific cross-reference that tied it to the university Jake attended, made it real in a way it had not been before. She said, "Jake's University Library, Reading Room Archive, 3rd floor. My father put it there specifically." Callum said, "Yes." She said, "He would have had to visit. He would have had to make the trip and set it up himself." Callum said, "He visited Jake twice during his first year at school. Both times the official reason was a family weekend. I did not know until now why he went those particular weekends." She thought about that. Her father taking the train to Boston, checking into the university, helping Jake move furniture or eat dinner at a good restaurant. And also, quietly, filing something in the reading room archive under a library number that no one would connect to anything unless they knew exactly what they were looking for. Her father, being 2 people at once, for 20 years, so thoroughly that the people he loved most never had to see the second one. She said, "We need to talk about what we do with all of this." Callum said, "Yes." She said, "Destroying people is not what he intended. I can see that in the structure. He documented everything, but the way he positioned the evidence locations, the way he cross-indexed them with public records, it is designed to verify, not to attack. He wanted the truth to be undeniable, not explosive." Callum said, "An archive, not a bomb." She said, "A library, one that outlasts the people who want to bury it." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "We need to talk about Mast." He said, Yes, she said. He is not just corrupt, he has infrastructure. Legal infrastructure, political infrastructure. A single piece of evidence does not stop someone like that, even several pieces. Callum said, no, but properly archived, properly protected, properly positioned in an institution with academic credibility and legal standing, the totality of what Edmund built becomes something different. It becomes a record that cannot be erased without creating the very exposure the person wants to avoid. She looked at him. You have already been thinking about this, he said. For 3 days, she said. So have I. A pause between them, both of them at the same conclusion by different routes. Then the phone in his pocket buzzed. He looked at it. Something shifted in his face. Small, but she caught it. He stood up. One of my people has been compromised. I need to handle this. He moved across the room. 3 calls in rapid succession, each one brief and precise. No raised voice, no drama, just clear, fast decision-making, the kind that comes from having done this so many times that panic has been entirely removed from the equation. She watched him from her side of the table. He glanced at her twice during those calls, not to check if she was safe, not to reassure her, to use her as a fixed point, like she was the thing in the room that kept his coordinates calibrated. She understood that instinctively. In an archive, when everything is moving, you fix your gaze on one known, stable thing, and you navigate from there. When the calls were done, he stood at the window. She went and stood beside him, not close enough to touch, just close enough that the city below was the same view for both of them. He said, 11 years working alone. It is easier. You move faster. You make decisions without having to account for anyone else. She said, but? He said, but tonight I looked up and you were in the room, and the decision was clearer. She said, Callum? His name in her mouth. Natural now, not formal. I think I understand what my father was saying. Not just with the maps. To me, specifically. He said, tell me. She said, he was saying, this is the world. Do not look away from it, and do not face it alone. He turned from the window, looked at her directly. She did not look away. He reached out slowly and placed his hand over hers where it rested on the windowsill. Gently. The way you set something down that you are not sure of yet. Testing the weight of it. She did not move her hand. They stood like that. The city going on below them. The lamp behind them casting its circle of light. Both of them very still. Later, she would think about this moment the way you think about the last warm day before winter really sets in. You do not know it is the last one until it is already past. It was a card slipped under the door of the Pilsen apartment. Tuesday morning. She found it before she was fully awake. A location. A time. One sentence. About your father. What Reyes has not told you. The handwriting was Marcus Webb's. She recognized it from the engagement paperwork she had been given 3 weeks ago when Bernard was still trying to make all of this feel like a normal transaction. She should have called Callum, she knew that. She went instead. Lincoln Park. A bench near the South Pond. Webb arrived 5 minutes after she did. He looked older than she remembered from the engagement dinner, tired in a way that went past one bad night. He sat down at a distance of about 4 feet, not threatening, not friendly. He said, I am glad you came. She said, you have 2 minutes. Start talking. He said, Callum Reyes knew your father was in danger. Not a suspicion, certain knowledge, a direct, specific, actionable threat. He received that information 7 days before Edmund died. She did not react for a moment. She took the information and placed it where it needed to go first. Sorted it before she processed it. Then she said, and he did not warn my father. Webb said, no. She said, why are you telling me this? He said, because I need you to understand who you are working with. She said, or you are the person who killed him. Those are the 2 possibilities I see from where I am sitting. He did not answer fast enough. She stood up. She said, "You took too long. That is my answer." She walked back through the park to the street, deliberately, not running, her mind working the whole time, sorting, placing, examining. She went directly to the 14th floor office. Phil saw her coming, and something in his face settled, like he had been expecting this particular version of her arrival eventually. She walked in. Callum was at his desk. He looked up when she entered. He did not ask what was wrong. He read her walk the same way she read document boxes. He knew something had shifted. She stood in the middle of the room. She said, "Did you know someone was coming for my father, 1 week before he died?" He did not answer immediately. 1 second. 2. She had been working with him long enough now to know exactly what that pause meant. He did not need time to think about things he did not know. He only needed time when the answer was bad. She said, "Tell me." He said, "I received a warning, general, not specific, that someone in my network was at risk. I increased security on 3 people." She said, "My father was not one of them." He said, "The intelligence I had indicated the primary target was me. He was not mentioned by name." She said, "But he died, not you." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you have known this for 8 months." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You let me spend a week in this room, reading his maps, telling you about my family, trusting you." She kept her voice even. "The entire time you knew you might have been able to save him." He said, "I did not know for certain that the warning was connected to what happened to him." She said, "You knew enough to wonder, and you chose not to tell me." He said nothing. She said, "Tell me why." He said, "Because I was afraid that if you knew, you would stop, and I needed you to finish reading the map." It was not a pretty answer. It was not dressed up or softened. It was simply the truth, laid down plainly, and it was worse than any excuse she could have imagined because it was honest. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "At least that is honest." Then his phone vibrated on the desk. He looked at it. Something in his face changed fast. He said, "Mast has moved. He is trying to reach Jake in Boston tonight, using him as leverage to slow this down." She felt it go cold through her chest. He was already moving. 3 calls, each one less than 90 seconds. The first dispatched 2 people to Boston. The second established a communication line with someone near Jake's building. The third confirmed position. All of it done in under 3 minutes. Then he looked at her. "Jake is safe. No one will get near him." She absorbed that. He had protected Jake, immediately, without hesitation. The younger brother of the man he had not protected. She picked up her coat. He said, "Nora." She said, "Jake is safe. That matters most right now." She put on the coat. He said, "I should have told you." She said, "Yes." She stopped at the door, did not turn around. She said, "The map is fully decoded. You have everything you need to finish what my father started. You do not need me here anymore." He said, "That is not what this is about." She said, "Good night, Callum." She walked out. In the elevator, she stood very still. The building hummed around her. Outside was the West Loop and the city and the cold and the 8 months of loss that she had been carrying and that had, for a brief strange week, felt like it might have been building towards something instead of just sitting there. She pressed the button for the ground floor. She walked home alone. 3 days. She did not go back to the office. She did not call. She worked alone at the small kitchen table in the Pilsen apartment, with her notebooks spread around her and her father's notation system decoded in her own hand. She traced each of the 7 evidence locations herself, not to retrieve them, to understand exactly what her father had built and exactly what he had intended. On the first day, she found the pattern of the whole. Edmund had not just documented crimes. He had documented the infrastructure that made those crimes sustainable. The political connections, the financial channels, the institutional protections, the full operating system of 2 decades of corrupted power. Any single piece was damaging. The full 7 together were something else. On the second day, she read every map her father had sent to Callum across 12 years. Not just the evidence maps, the geographic ones, the notational ones, and embedded in all of them, in the center ring, consistent and unchanged across 12 years, was Callum's marker. Her father had known who Callum was, all of it. The things he protected people from, and the things he needed to be protected from. He had mapped Callum with complete information, and he had kept him in the center ring. She sat with that for a long time. She called Jake. He answered on the second ring. "Hey, you sound better than you did last week," she said. "I need to tell you something real." He went quiet. She told him, not everything, but the shape of it. Their father had been doing dangerous work for the last 20 years of his life. He had believed it mattered. He had done it alone because he thought that protected them. And he had loved them both by building something that would outlast him, and by trusting that they were strong enough to be part of finishing it. Jake was quiet for a long time after she stopped talking. Then he said, "Did he trust you to finish it?" She said, "Yes." Jake said, "Then finish it, Nora. That is the whole message. Everything else he did was just making sure you had what you needed to do that." She pressed the phone against her ear and did not say anything for a moment. He said, "I should have known something was going on. I should have pushed harder." She said, "I was protecting you." He said, "I know, but Nora, I am not 15 anymore." She looked at the notes spread across the table. Her father's notation in her handwriting, the language he had built for her when she was a child, in her hands, pointed at what he had spent his life building. She said, "I know, I am sorry." He said, "Don't be sorry, just call me more." She said, "I will." She hung up and sat with the silence of the apartment for a while. Meanwhile, across the city, Callum went to see Marcus Webb. He had not told Nora he was doing this. He went to Webb's office, which was unusual. He met people on his own territory. Not today. Webb did not look surprised to see him. He poured 2 glasses of water and sat down. Callum said, "Tell me what you know about Edmund. Not the evidence. Him." Webb looked at his glass. "Edmund was the most careful man I ever met. For 20 years I watched him build something enormous, while appearing to do nothing remarkable at all." A pause. "He came to me twice in the last year. He was checking who was still trustworthy. He did not tell me he was doing it, but I knew." Callum said, "He trusted me with his daughter." Webb said, "He trusted you with his daughter's safety without telling her. Those are not the same thing as trusting you with everything. That is trusting you with what matters." He looked at Callum directly. "The question is whether you understand what that means." Callum said, "I failed him." Webb said, "Once. Then you spent 8 months not failing everyone else. That is a real thing. The question is not what you did. The question is what you do now that you know what it costs." Callum drove back to the West Loop office, sat down at his desk. He opened a new file on his computer, typed 2 words, Nora Voss, looked at the blank document, put his fingers on the keyboard, did not type anything, closed the file, did not delete it, left it empty. He sat for a moment looking at the closed file icon. Then he opened a different file and got back to work. Because Mast had not stopped moving. While Nora was silent and he was working through what he had broken, the senator had used a political connection to submit a formal documentation request to the Hargrove Institute. Legal letterhead, proper signatures, a request for materials relevant to a federal investigation. This was how you erased evidence legally. Callum sent a message to 3 journalists at 3 different publications. Each one received a different piece of the same preliminary evidence. Each one knew nothing about the other 2. Not enough for prosecution, but enough for a story, and enough for Mass to understand that the story existed and could become more of a story at any time. Mast withdrew the request within 48 hours. Callum leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He had bought time. He had not solved the problem. The problem was that the full archive of what Edmund had built still needed to be assembled and placed somewhere permanent and protected. And the person who understood both the content and the proper archival system was in an apartment in Pilsen and not answering his calls. He could find her. He could find anyone in this city. But finding her and having the right to ask her to come back were not the same thing. He looked at the empty file on his screen. He had a map for every street in Chicago. He did not have a map for this. 7 days after she walked out, Nora walked back in. No call ahead. She simply came. Phil was at the security desk. He looked at her, and the expression on his face was the particular expression of someone who has been quietly relieved of a worry they didn't know they were carrying. He opened the door without being asked. She rode up to the 14th floor. Callum was at his desk reading. He set the book down when she walked in. Not closed, set aside, like something he would come back to. She stood in the middle of the room. She said, "I have 2 conditions." He said, "Tell me." She said, "1. Any information that affects my safety or Jake's, you tell me immediately. Not after you have decided what to do with it, not after you have weighed the mission, immediately." He said, "Agreed." She said, "2. When this is over, I want to know everything. Not a summary, everything. I will decide what to do with it." He said, "That is not a simple thing to commit to." She said, "I know. It is what I need." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Agreed." She walked to the table and put her coat over the back of her chair. The chair she had used every day for the past 2 weeks. Her chair. She said, "I am not telling you I have forgiven you." He said, "I am not asking you to." She said, "I am telling you I understand why you made the choice you made. It was wrong. You know it was wrong. You." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is enough to move forward." She pulled out her notebook. "Show me where we are." They worked. It was different from before. The pretense of distance was gone. There was nothing to perform now, no careful management of what they said or what they let through. What was broken had been broken openly. What remained was simpler than what had come before. At one point in the afternoon, Callum described his plan for approaching a financial records witness, someone who had worked adjacent to Webb's operation and knew enough to confirm one of the evidence chains. He had a plan. It was a good plan. He had been doing this for 11 years. He said, "What would you do? In my position?" She looked up. He was genuinely asking. She said, "He is scared of being exposed, but not of the truth. He would respond better to being given a reason to talk than being given a reason to stay quiet. Ask him what he wants to protect, not what he knows." Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he adjusted his notes. He used her suggestion. Later, when they had to go to the first evidence location in person, a storage unit in a suburb to the south, mass people were waiting outside the facility, not armed, watching, with a second vehicle blocking the exit lane. Callum started directing. Left exit, through the main route, she goes first, he stays behind. Nora said, "Wait." She had been watching the layout from a different angle. She could see something he could not from his position. A service door at the back of the facility, a blind spot in the visual coverage from the street. She said, "Service door, northeast corner. There is a loading corridor that runs behind the unit row. It exits on the parallel street." He looked at her. 2 seconds. He said, "Take the lead." She did. They came out clean on the other side with the first evidence package in hand. 3 boxes of original financial records from 1998 through 2004, exactly where her father's map said they would be. Walking back to the car, Callum said, "You were right." She said, "I know." He said, "About the service door." She said, "I know." A pause, then quieter. "You would have made a very good cartographer." She looked straight ahead. She knew what he was actually saying. She did not answer with words, but something in her chest relaxed in a way it had not relaxed in a week. That evening, back at the office, the maps were put away. The table was clear. She said, "My father left one more note. Not in the maps. Separate. inside a book he gave me when I started at Hargrove. I found it last week. He said, "What did it say?" She said, "He said the most important thing he ever mapped was the people worth protecting. He listed 3 names." A pause. She said, "Mine, Jake's." A longer pause. She said, "Callum's." He went very still. She said, "He wrote it before your decision, before the warning, based on who he knew you to be at that time." He said, "That does not change what happened." She said, "No, I know that." She looked at him directly. "But he was not saying you are perfect. He was saying you are worth it, worth the difficulty, worth the risk, worth being wrong about and still trying." A pause. "I think he was right. And I think I might be right about both those things too." He did not say anything for a moment. The heating system ran quietly. The city continued outside the window. He said, "Thank you for coming back." She said, "I did not come back for you. I came back to finish what my father started." A pause. She said, "But I am glad you are the person I am finishing it with." The next 10 days were the most focused work Nora had ever done in her life. 6 of the 7 evidence locations were recovered in person. Each one required a different approach. Each one was exactly where her father's map said it would be, and each one proved again and again how precisely Edmund Voss had planned every detail of what he was leaving behind. A storage unit in Cicero, a locked box in a law office records room in the Loop, deposited under a case number that looked like routine municipal archive from the outside. A sealed envelope in the safe deposit department of a bank in Rogers Park, left under a trust instrument that bore Edmund's name. A hard drive and 3 bound ledgers in a decommissioned office space in Hyde Park that had once been leased to an LLC with no visible connection to anything, and 2 more, hidden inside what looked like routine architectural drawings at a county records office. Jake found the 7th. He called on a Thursday evening. She could hear from his voice that he was standing still. He said, "Nora, I am holding an envelope. It was in the University Library Reading Room Archive, 3rd floor, filed under a collection number that is not in the public catalog. The librarian found it when I described the notation system you told me to look for." A pause. "On the outside it says, 'Open when my daughter comes looking.'" She closed her eyes for 1 second. He said, "He knew everything in advance." She said, "He was a cartographer." He said, "What does that mean exactly when you say it like that?" She said, "It means he mapped every possible version of what might happen, and in all of them, he trusted that we would get here." Jake overnighted it. When all 7 pieces were assembled on the work table in the 14th floor office, the full scope of what Edmund Voss had built became clear. Not a dossier on one man, not a file on one network, an archive. 2 decades of documentation showing how political ambition and organized money had moved together through the state. Every major approval, every channeled fund, every name that appeared in one world and then another, connecting them. The kind of record that could not be dismissed, could not be called opinion or speculation, because it was receipts, dates, signatures, movement of real money through real accounts over real time. Senator Harlan Mast was at the center of it, but the web was much wider than one man. Callum stood at the table looking at the assembled materials. Then he said, "He didn't intend this for law enforcement." Nora said, "No." He said, "Too much would be buried. The wrong cases would be assigned. The wrong judges would hear them." She said, "He didn't intend it for the press either. A story runs for a week and then it is managed, disputed, discredited." He looked at her. She said, "He intended it for an archive." She said it the way her father might have said it, with the particular respect for the word that comes from spending your career in one. She said, "Hargrove Institute, properly catalogued, sealed under academic protection for 25 years, long enough that the people who want it buried will be gone or powerless. And when the seal lifts, it will be in the hands of scholars and historians with the standing to say, 'This is what happened. This is documented. This is real.'" She said, "That is why he chose me. Not just because I could read the maps, because I am the person who knows how to make something permanent, how to make something survive. Callum said, he built the most patient possible weapon. She said, he built a record for people who come after. That is what archives are. They are not for the present. They are a gift to the future. The next morning, Callum met Senator Mast. They met in a private conference room at a building in the Gold Coast, neutral ground. Mast arrived with a lawyer. Callum arrived alone. He set a summary document on the table, not the full archive. A detailed index of what existed, where it was, and what it documented. He said, this archive goes into the Hargrove Institute under academic protection, sealed for 25 years. By then the landscape will have changed enough that it may no longer matter, or it will matter enough that it needs to be found. Mast looked at the document. Then he looked at Callum. He said, and if I take action against anyone connected to this? Callum said, it releases, all of it, simultaneously, through 7 independent channels. Mast said, you would expose yourself in the process. Callum looked at him and said, Edmund Voss spent 20 years building something he believed would protect people, not by destroying those who wronged them, by making sure the truth outlasted them. I am in the business of honoring that. What I expose about myself does not weigh as much as what I protect from what he built. Mast sat with that. His lawyer made a note on a legal pad. Then Mast stood up, gathered his jacket, and walked out of the room without another word. The document request to Hargrove was formally withdrawn by end of business that day. That evening, Nora was working late in the archive. Alone in the familiar quiet of Shelf 12F and the fluorescent lights and the 34,000 documents she knew by heart. She heard the door. Callum walked in carrying 2 coffees. She looked at him. It is done? He said. Mast will not move. The materials go into processing tomorrow. She said. And you? He said. I need to tell you what I said to him. He told her. Word for word. The sentence about Edmund and the truth outlasting people and what he was in the business of honoring. She listened. Studied him. She said, you meant it. He said, yes. She said, that is different. He said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she went to the shelf. 3rd row from the top on shelf 8A. A box she had catalogued herself, under her own employee number, with a flag she had placed there 2 weeks ago when she found it. She brought it to the work table and set it between them. She said, my father left one more thing. Not in the maps, not in the notes I found at home. Here, in this archive, catalogued under my number with my flag, so I would find it when I came back to work. He looked at the box. She said, his journals, 20 years of them. Everything he thought and observed that he did not encode in the maps. Everything he saw in the people around him. She pushed it toward him gently. He catalogued the access under your clearance, not mine. He knew you would eventually be in this room. Callum looked at the box for a long moment. Then he looked at her. He said, he mapped everything. She said, everything he believed was worth keeping. Another long pause, the kind that feels like something settling into place. Then Callum said, Nora, what do you want, after all of this is done? She said, after all of this meaning what exactly? He said, after the archive is processed, after the maps are filed, after there is no longer any practical reason that requires us to be in the same room. She thought about it honestly. She said, I want to keep doing this, finding what people leave behind, understanding why they left it, making sure the right things survive. A pause. What about you? He sat with the question. He said, I want to stop knowing everything about everyone before they know it themselves. I want to walk into a room without a file already prepared. I want to find out, instead of already knowing. She said, that sounds genuinely terrifying for you. He said, yes. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close. She said, there is a research consultation position opening at the Institute, someone who understands how information networks form over time. how patterns in historical records reflect present-day behavior. She paused. The pay is terrible. He said, I do not need the money. She said, I know. She said, Are you seriously considering this? He said, Are you seriously offering it? She said quietly, I am offering you a reason to show up somewhere every day, where someone will notice if you do not. He stood up, crossed the room slowly. He placed his hand against the side of her face, the way she touched her father's maps, testing whether the thing was real before trusting it fully. She did not move. He said, I will show up. She said, Every day? He said, Every day you will let me. She looked at him. He looked back. In 11 years, he had mapped everything worth knowing about Chicago. Every street, every network, every pattern, every person who mattered. He had not mapped this. He was standing in a room surrounded by 34,000 documents, with her father's life work in a box on the table between them, in territory that had never been charted by anyone. He found, to his considerable surprise, that he was not afraid of it. 6 months later, the Hargrove Institute on a Tuesday afternoon in April. The snow was gone. The sidewalks outside were just damp. Through the archive windows, you could see the trees on the street beginning to come back. Nora was at her desk, working. The same lamp, the same chair, the same shelf she could navigate in the dark. And 2 steps to her left, at a smaller research desk that the Institute's board had agreed to add after several weeks of Nora making the case for an external consultation program, was a notebook, a pen, and no laptop. Callum. He did not officially work for Hargrove. That would have been too neat, too simple. He came 3 afternoons a week, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Phil knew his coffee order. Dennis had stopped treating his presence as unusual approximately 3 weeks into the arrangement. And Nora knew when he was coming without checking her phone, the way you know without looking when a room has shifted. The project they were building together had a simple title in the Institute's catalog: Chicago Power Structures, 1980 to Present. An ongoing historical collection, properly encoded, properly sealed, with a public-facing version that said nothing dangerous and a full version that said everything, locked under access protocols that could only be triggered by specific conditions that Nora had designed herself. It was the most sophisticated thing she had ever built in her professional life. It was also, in a way she did not say out loud, a continuation of her father's life's work, by different hands, in the same building, for the same reason. Jake came to Chicago for a long weekend in late April. He had submitted his thesis. He was finishing his final semester. He looked rested in a way she had not seen in 2 years. He met Callum properly for the first time, in the archive, on a Saturday afternoon when Nora was catching up on cataloging. Jake shook his hand, looked at him with the measured assessment of someone who takes his role as younger brother seriously regardless of age differential. In the hallway outside, Jake said to Nora quietly, He is kind of terrifying. She said, He is kind of everything. Jake thought about that. Dad would have liked him. She looked through the glass wall. Callum was talking to Phil. 2 men with almost nothing in common, having found a language between them anyway. Phil was saying something that made Callum's expression shift in a way it rarely shifted. Something close to a smile. She said, Dad did like him. 15 years. Jake nodded slowly. Then I think I can figure it out over one weekend. Later that evening, the archive closed. Phil said goodnight. Dennis said goodnight. The building went quiet. Nora walked the shutdown routine. Lights off by row, the same path she had walked 1,000 times, shelf by shelf. The familiar smell of old paper and climate control. The low hum of the building settling. She cut the last row of lights. Callum was at the door with his coat over his arm, waiting. He was always at the door by the time she got there. She said, Ready? He said, Yes. They walked out together. Chicago in April. Cold still, but different cold. The kind that is on its way to becoming something else. Nora put her hands in her coat pockets. The note her father had written was not there. She had put it somewhere safer, properly archived, properly preserved. But she knew the words without it. He had said, "The most important thing I ever mapped was the people worth protecting." 3 names. She had thought, when she first read that he was talking about his work, about the evidence archive, about the years of careful documentation meant to protect a world she had not known existed. Now she understood he was not talking about that at all. He was talking about what he wanted her to keep. After the archive was sealed, and the evidence was placed, and the senator had retreated into his careful quiet. After all the machinery of it was done. He was talking about this. The walk out the door, the city in April, the particular way that 2 people can move through a cold evening together and make the cold feel like less than it is. She had his hands, his habit of noticing, his faith that the right things, kept properly, outlast everything else. She carried that forward. 6 months ago, she had fled a forced marriage with nothing but a note and a name, and she had climbed into the wrong car in a hotel parking garage in her engagement party dress. And she had sat on the floor behind the front seats and held her breath while footsteps passed. She had been so afraid. She remembered that clearly. But her father had spent 20 years leaving her the tools she would need: the language, the maps, the address in the West Loop, the name. And one more thing, which she understood now and had not understood then. He had left her the proof that she was capable of finishing it. The proof was in how he left everything, in the fact that he had not left it to anyone else. He had left it to her. That was the whole message. That was everything he had been trying to say for years in the only language he had. Beside her, Callum said nothing. He walked with her. He was there. That was the entirety of what was required, and he knew it. The city block went by. Then another one. The lake was somewhere ahead, invisible but present. Chicago, always. She said, "My father was right about you." Callum said, "You have said that before." She said, "I am saying it again." A pause between them. He said, "He was right about you too, for whatever that is worth." She said, "Coming from him, it is worth quite a lot." They kept walking. The archive behind them, properly closed, its 34,000 documents in their places, and her father's work sealed and safe and waiting for whoever would one day need to find it. The things worth keeping, kept properly, outlast everything else. Edmund Voss had believed that for his entire life. His daughter was beginning to understand that he had been right about more things than she had known, including this, especially this. This book is a work of imagination. Names, characters, places, and incidents either are products of the author's creativity or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is unintentional and should not be construed as factual representation.
This story is not about a woman who got lucky by hiding in the right car. It is about a woman who had been invisible her entire life, invisible to the people who were supposed to see her, invisible even to herself, and who, in one quiet November night, decided that invisibility was no longer something she was willing to accept. And that decision changed everything. The first lesson this story carries is simple but difficult. Knowing your own worth is not arrogance. It is survival. Nora did not walk out of that hotel room because someone told her she deserved better. She walked out because she finally read the words her father had been trying to say for 20 years. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you know. That sentence cost Edmund Voss his life to write, and it cost his daughter everything she thought was safe to act on. But she acted on it anyway, because some truths, once read, cannot be unread. The second lesson lives in the way Edmund Voss built his life's work. He did not build a weapon. He did not build a case designed to explode in a single dramatic moment. He built a record, patient, precise, permanent. He understood something that most people in positions of power never learn. Destruction is temporary. Truth, properly kept, is not. The most powerful thing any person can do is not to defeat their enemy in a single blow. It is to make sure the truth outlasts them. That is a different kind of strength, a quieter kind. And in the long run, it is the only kind that holds. The third lesson belongs to Callum, a man who spent 11 years believing that knowing everything was the same as being safe, that information was the same as connection, that a file on every person he trusted was the same as trusting them. He was wrong, and it cost him the one thing no archive can recover: the moment he could not get back, the warning he received and did not act on. The lesson there is not that knowledge is dangerous. The lesson is that knowledge, without honesty, without the willingness to share the difficult truth with the people who need to hear it, is just another way of being alone. And perhaps the deepest lesson of all is this: the people who love us do not always say it in words we can hear in real time. Sometimes they say it in what they build, in what they leave behind, in the care they take to make sure that even after they are gone, we will have what we need to find our way. Pay attention to what the people who love you are quietly building for you. It may be the most important thing they ever say.